Do you believe that 300 men can defeat an entire army? Get ready for one of the most impressive stories in the Bible. The incredible victory of Gideon over the Midianites with just 300 men, a narrative full of courage, strategy, and above all, faith in God. Stay until the end and discover how Gideon trusted in the divine promise and achieved a miraculous victory. Gideon's calling. The story of Gideon is recorded in the book of Judges, chapters 6 to 8. The people of Israel were oppressed by the Midianites, who constantly plundered their crops and destroyed their resources. In this context of despair, God chose Gideon, an ordinary man, to deliver Israel. When Gideon received the call from the angel of the Lord, he was threshing wheat in secret, fearing the enemies. Despite his doubts, God called him a mighty warrior and promised to be with him. Gideon asked for signs to be sure that he was truly chosen by God, and the Lord patiently responded, strengthening his faith. Before becoming a leader, Gideon doubted his abilities. He questioned how he could deliver Israel, being from one of the smallest tribes and from an insignificant family. However, Gideon's story shows us that God does not see as men do. He looks at the heart and the willingness to obey. Gideon's test with the fleece. To be sure of God's calling, Gideon asked for a sign. He placed a fleece of wool on the ground and asked that, by morning, the fleece would be wet with dew while the ground around it remained dry. God performed this sign, but Gideon asked for another proof this time, for the fleece to remain dry while the ground was wet. God, in his patience, granted Gideon this additional confirmation. The context of Midianite oppression. The Midianites were a constant threat to the people of Israel. They invaded their lands like swarms of locusts, destroying crops and stealing livestock. Israel was cornered, living hidden in caves and fearing reprisals. They cried out to God for help, and the Lord responded by raising Gideon as a judge and deliverer. Beyond economic destruction, the Israelites suffered spiritually as they began to drift away from God and follow other gods. Midianite oppression was a reminder of their departure from God's covenant, and Gideon was called to restore both the physical security and the spiritual faith of the people. Israel's idolatry had led to their condition of servitude. They turned to pagan gods like Baal and Asherah, and God allowed the oppression as a form of correction. Before facing the enemies, Gideon had to tear down the altar of Baal in his own family, showing that spiritual victory precedes physical victory. Hello, please check if you are already subscribed to our channel, like and comment your opinion about this video. Gideon's fears. Even after receiving signs from God, Gideon still felt fear. He asked God for courage to move forward. Often, even in the face of divine certainty, we still hesitate and feel fear. But Gideon's story teaches us that God provides the strength needed to face our challenges. The reduction of the army. Initially, Gideon gathered an army of 32,000 men. However, God had other plans. He instructed Gideon to reduce the number so that Israel would know that victory would come through divine power, not human strength. First, God ordered all those who were fearful to go home, leaving 10,000 men. Then, in the water test, only those who drank by bringing the water to their mouths with their hands were chosen. In the end, only 300 men remained. The reduction of the army highlighted the importance of trusting God rather than relying on human forces. This lesson remains relevant today, reminding us that true strength comes from faith, preparation for battle, The 300 chosen men were mentally and spiritually prepared by Gideon. Their faith was what made them strong. Gideon encouraged them with words of confidence, reminding them that victory was already guaranteed by the Lord. The test of the fire. Before the battle, God gave Gideon additional confirmation. He instructed him to go down to the enemy camp and listen to a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. Gideon heard one of the soldiers tell a dream about a loaf of barley bread rolling down and destroying the Midianite tent. The other interpreted the dream as a sign that Gideon would prevail. This sign renewed Gideon's confidence. The divine strategy. With this small army, Gideon followed God's instructions. They were divided into 3 groups of 100 men, each armed with trumpets, empty jars, and torches inside the jars. At night, around the enemy camp, Gideon and his men blew their trumpets, broke the jars, and shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The Midianite army, in the midst of confusion and panic, turned against themselves and fled in disorder. Gideon then pursued the enemies and secured the final victory over Israel's oppressors. The impact of Gideon's victory. Gideon's victory brought a period of 40 years of peace to Israel. The people recognized Gideon as a great leader and even asked him to become king. However, Gideon refused, stating that only God should rule over Israel. He did, however, request gold from the spoils of war, with which he made an ephod, which unfortunately led the people into sin. This part of the story highlights how humans can fall into traps even after great victories. Trust in God must be constant to avoid straying from the right path. The lesson of faith and obedience. Gideon's story teaches us that strength is not in numbers but in trusting God. When we trust in the divine plan, no matter the size of the challenge, with God by our side, victory is certain. Furthermore, we learn that humility is essential. Gideon started with humility, but his story shows the dangers of pride and idolatry. If you enjoyed this inspiring story, share it with your friends and leave your comment on what impacted you the most.